Hello, good afternoon all. Thank you for joining us on this Lunch and Learn. It's the first of the academic year, so welcome. You've joined us for Autism Feeding and Eating Challenges. So maybe pop into the chat where you're listening from. My name is Carrie. I'm one of the outreach consultants as part of the research and learning team from Beyond Autism. And hopefully you get to learn a few things about autism feeding and eating challenges. So what we're covering today is an introduction, what are the challenges for autistic children, what are the impacts of feeding and eating challenges, understanding the challenges, and then proposing some of the strategies and interventions. So eating and feeding can be challenging for many children. It's reported that up to 35% of children display difficulties with eating. Eventually, some children begin to accept new foods, which obviously enables a healthy and varied diet. However, overcoming eating and feeding can be more difficult for autistic children and their families. It's reported that up to 89% of autistic children display some form of difficulty with feeding behaviors. And 2 out of 3 parents of autistic children report that their child is reluctant to trying new foods. Okay, so with regards to eating and feeding challenges, we might have food selectivity, and this is defined as the consumption of a limited variety of food items and the rejection of most novel foods. So you might be able to resonate to some of these items on the list for your children and young people, but it can include only eating room temperature food, only eating crunchy food, only eating certain brands of items, so not accepting anything other than Heinz beans, for example, only eating food from specific outlets, so it must be chicken nuggets that are from McDonald's and then nothing other. It can also include eating foods of a certain color, texture, or shape, or eating out of specific plates or bowls or with specific cutlery. It can also include not eating food if it's presented in a specific way. So some children are averse to their foods touching each other, and also not eating fruits or vegetables. Other challenges that are reported are children struggling to sit and difficulty eating during meal times, so that's 89%, or the spontaneous elimination of previously eaten foods from their diet, that's around 56%, and also the refusal to touch food or utensils, 11%. With regards to food selectivity, it can mean that the child has a very narrow range of foods in their diet. And food preference studies on children show that there's a higher preference towards energy-dense foods. And despite the research highlighting that autistic children achieve generally similar heights and weights to typically developing children, there are some differences. So we've got 2/3 of autistic children eat fewer than 20 foods and do not access all basic food groups. Autistic children are also more likely to consume starches and carbohydrates than any other food group. And autistic children are most often selective against fruits and vegetables, that's 58 to 71%, and meats or beans, 24 to 35%, and milk and dairy, 18%. There are also other reported feeding and eating challenges. So this might be pica, and that involves eating and mouthing non-edible items. So your children and young people might be consuming sand, chalk, mud, items that are obviously not edible. There's also rumination, so that's voluntarily regurgitating food that has already been ingested, and then the child or young person re-chewing and swallowing. Anorexia, that's defined as the eating disorder where individuals desire to lose weight or they fear gaining weight, and they do this by not eating enough food and or over-exercising. We've also got avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, and that's avoiding specific foods based on sensory properties, but this ARFID is not governed by the desire to lose weight. So when it comes to these feeding and eating challenges, it's important that you speak to a professional, that being a GP, health visitor, pediatrician, or dietitian, if you are more concerned. It's important to think about the medical considerations. So bowel problems such as diarrhea and constipation are very common among autistic children. and that can obviously affect their appetite. So 24% experience loose stools, 24% experience constipation, and 33% strain to move their bowels. So in order to support children and young people with these conditions, doctors often advise on dietary changes and or suggest oral medication. But this in itself is quite difficult to administer. Another medical consideration is that limited food and limited diet can lead to nutritional deficiencies. So the results do vary across studies, but the most common reported deficiencies are calcium, iron, fiber, vitamin C and D in autistic children. Also, going back to PICA, which is eating non-edible items, that may be indicative of your child or young person either having a vitamin or mineral deficiency. Another medical consideration is that food selectivity can also lead to tooth decay, especially if the foods are centered on quite sugary based foods. So how do we understand these challenges related to feeding and eating? We need to think about the following. So in autistic individuals, there might be a lack of flexibility in their thinking. They may be quite controlled and rigid and maybe following rules and being rule governed. They might also display some obsessions. So how that manifests could be that they have an intense interest in calorie counting, or they may only specifically discuss food related topics, or they might want things a certain way. So going back to that example of food being presented in a specific way, they might have inflexibility with regards to that. If we think about communication difficulties, often our young people and children may struggle to communicate their preferences, their feelings, or their difficulties. So with regards to foods, they might not be able to tell their parent or caregiver that they don't like a specific taste or they want food in a certain way. So these are things to consider with regards to the challenges. Social interactions are also important to take note of. So meal times are social times. This can either be very positive or negative. Autistic children and young people may struggle to be in social situations, and therefore they might be quite avoidant of being in that situation, and therefore may not actually eat food or consume food. Motor issues are also another issue to think about. So do they have difficulties with their oral motor planning? Do they have the ability to use their jaw, to chew, to swallow? And also, can they coordinate how to use their knife and fork, or to sip from a straw, or to bring their cup to their mouth? There's also medical considerations, so physical pain, discomfort, illness. These are things to bear in mind, that constipation and heartburn might be affecting your child or young person, and also effects of medication. So it might be that their appetite is suppressed, therefore they don't want to eat, or it might be that they're consuming too much food. So that is something to bear in mind and something to raise with medical professionals. We've also got behavioral issues. So if we go back to the fact that there is inflexibility with regards to thinking, your child or young person might develop ritualistic behaviors, and therefore when you are presenting food, it does raise some strong negative reactions. Finally, to understand these challenges, we need to look at sensory issues. So how do they process the environment and how do they deal with that? Okay. So from a behavioral perspective, let's think about reinforcement. What is it that's maintaining the eating and feeding challenges? It can come from two sources of reinforcement. So either negative reinforcement, the rejected food item gets removed, which then reinforces the child and reinforces the non-eating behavior. So you've presented, let's say, broccoli on their plate, and they've said no, and then mum or dad or teachers remove that broccoli, and then that reinforces that behavior in the future again. Positive reinforcement, so either attention or access to preferred food items may be provided, which again would reinforce the inappropriate mealtime behaviors. So they might have had, let's say, behavior that challenges, and therefore you've then suggested that they can now have their chips or chocolate. Quantity and quality of reinforcement should always be considered. Food reinforcers can be really helpful as they replace the flavor of unpreferred food with the flavor of preferred food, but it's something to keep in mind that especially with regards to eating and appetite, it might be that you're increasing the preferred foods at that point. Deprivation, so this includes limiting access to preferred foods before what's known as intervention meals. So this might also increase your child's motivation for them. Okay. If we go back to some of the issues, so social issues might have been contributing to the feeding and eating challenges. So at home, families may increase anxiety around mealtimes by forcing their child to eat, and this can set up a pattern of mealtime stress. So it's important that children feel relaxed beforehand, and a way to do this could be creating a routine. By being able to sit together for meal times, you can model what your child is meant to be doing. Caregivers can also teach how to eat, but can also teach what to eat. So developmentally appropriate foods. They can also teach the mechanisms of eating, so how to navigate cutting their chicken, for example, or using a spoon to put it to their mouth. Again, eating together supports your child to learn through imitation, as they have role models in the adults around them. Another suggestion or strategy may be to use a tasting plate for the entire family, and also a no thank you plate. So this might reduce behaviors that challenge, because you then have an option where your child can either choose or have some control over what they're eating, but also appropriately say no to the items that they don't want. It's important that we reduce the emotions around meal times. So try to refrain from commenting or making a fuss. If your child does spit out the food, it's an opportunity for you to try again, maybe when they're a little bit calmer. Still sticking with the social interactions. So we touched on this earlier, that autistic individuals can find social situations difficult. They may not know how to act or how to engage with peers around them, or may feel overwhelmed. So because the meal times are social situations, autistic individuals may avoid communal spaces. They may work through their lunchtime slot or go to a completely different space and eat alone, or they may entirely abandon eating, so therefore they're not consuming anything in their diet. So a way to do this would be to develop some social skills outside of the meal times, and this can be really helpful. So social skill groups can be set up in schools by professionals. It can be a way to break down abstract social concepts into concrete actions. So the social groups would be involved in teaching the young person or child how to predict and how to respond in certain social situations. So it gives them some structure, it gives them some predictability, and it fosters a self-awareness and self-esteem in them. So if they are in the cafeteria, for example, they've already been taught how to respond to a peer asking them for the salt and pepper, or a peer sitting next to them, or a peer asking how their day was when they're sitting at the table together. So these are things that you can practice outside of meal times if you're finding that your child or young person is struggling being in the dining hall, or appears to be a little bit more isolated. Now we're going into our sensory issues. So many autistic children experience sensory differences. They can be one of two, which is either hypersensitive or hypersensitive to sight, sounds, smells, tastes, and textures. And this can result in them having a different relationship with food and often seeking safe foods. So for those children and young people that are hyposensitive, that is a decreased sensitivity to sensory input, their safe foods would be things that are spicier, stronger, hotter in temperature, crunchier, or even harder. On the reverse of that, you have hypersensitive, which is children and young people who might have increased sensitivity to sensory input. So the safe foods that they would be seeking out would be either bland foods or soft foods, and they would be avoiding sloppy food. If we stick with the sensory issues, we can discuss food chaining. So this is a strategy to link safe foods with new foods. It follows a trajectory where you'll move from maintaining and then eventually expanding tastes and textures. So you would start off initially with a safe food, and you'd make small changes. In this example, we're going to discuss potatoes. So in step 1, you'd maintain the texture but vary the taste. So instead of their usual potatoes, it might be trialing sweet potatoes, or it might be trialing adding a sauce or a dip to vary the taste. Once they've accomplished that step, you can then move on to step 2, which is maintaining the taste but varying the texture. So luckily, the potato is very versatile, so you can use either baking, mashing, boiling, or even frying the potatoes. Again, once that step is mastered with food shading, you can move on to step 3, which is varying the taste and varying the texture. At this stage, the child or young person should be comfortable with novel tastes and textures. Okay. In addition to temperature, smell, texture, and sight of food, it's also important to consider the sensory environment. So, where the child is eating can have an impact on their feeding and eating behaviors. We can make adaptations within school settings, care home settings, in the home settings, just to make sure that mealtime experience is more positive. So, an autistic child may find the school dining hall very, very loud and distracting. So one strategy there might be to support them with using ear defenders, or it might be in the home that they find the TV to be too distracting, or alternatively, they actually might want relaxing music to be played. So pairing up that environment with something that they enjoy, which might be music. Thinking about the basics, looking at the seating, is it too hard or too soft? Toomey 2002 highlighted that postural stability and the ability to sit upright is essential during meal times. So is the table at an appropriate height, at elbow height? Are the child's or young person's feet, are they supported? And is the length of time that you're expecting them to sit during that mealtime, is it too lengthy? So these are some considerations with regards to sensory issues. Okay, we've also got some calming and coping strategies to address these challenges. So for one, looking at predictable routines, there should be 3 meals a day that are spaced apart. Understandably, we all like to snack and graze. However, snacking and grazing can affect a child's appetite and can affect them in terms of satiation and whether they do feel hunger. So create a calm atmosphere beforehand can include applying deep pressure to make sure that they're feeling a little bit more relaxed. If your child is especially fixated on certain brands, it might be that you peel off labels before they're eating or while you're food preparing so that they're not fixated on a specific type of brand being consumed. During meal times, also have at least one familiar food on your child's plate. This sets them up for success and enables you to reinforce them, even if it's a food that they are quite familiar with. If your child is also particular about food touching, another strategy could be around using a partition plate so that the different food types are separated. And eventually that might be moving from a partition plate to a standard flat plate. Make sure that you are addressing basic sensory needs. So looking at whether they've got water or a drink available to address thirst. And if they have difficulties with getting dirty or messy around meal times, then it could be that you provide napkins or tissues as well as aprons. So we're going to go a little bit into graduated exposure. This involves starting with foods that are similar in taste, texture, and sight to foods that are already in your child's diet. It can include reintroducing foods that your child has previously eaten but now refuses. At this point, you might want to trial foods such as yogurts, purees, or puddings, foods that can't be pocketed in their cheeks and can't be spat out. So these are items that you may start with. Another tip is around reaction. So if they do spit out the food, just kind of move on from that and then be patient with yourselves, acknowledging that trying the food can be the biggest challenge. So we're going to go a little bit into graduated and repeated exposure now. So this involves, it's a hierarchy of successive approximations to the target food. So you'll create an example hierarchy where reinforcement is provided at each stage. Reinforcement could look like a high five, social praise, acknowledgement, or it could look like the delivery of a tangible item such as time with the iPad. Initially, no food is expected to be consumed for the child to receive reinforcement, and this means that the motivation to escape meal times is reduced. If the expectation is there from the beginning, then again, it sets it up for failure. Graduated exposure is generally not considered an aversive strategy. It, however, can be quite time consuming. So this example to the right is a very basic hierarchy. However, I'll go into a more detailed one in the coming slides. Some top tips around graduated exposure is start where the child is successful, work on each stage multiple times to build momentum, provide reinforcement at each stage, aim to finish each session on a high, so finish at the stage where they were successful, and then start again next time at the same stage or the stage previously. Stages can be added or skipped as you progress, and you want to save a high value reinforcer that they don't usually access or that they're especially motivated by for this type of strategy. So this is a more comprehensive hierarchy than the previous one. So if we look at the bottom, this is where you would start. So looking at tolerating behaviors. So does your child or young person tolerate being in the same room as the food? Once you've got to that stage, you'll look at, can they be at the table with the food on the other side? Can they then be at the table with the food halfway across the table? Can they be at the table with the food just outside of their space? And can they look at the food when it's directly in their space? You will move through these stages. This is, again, very comprehensive, but it can be tailored according to your child or young person. So then from the tolerating stage, you want to look at interaction. Are they able to assist in preparation with food, either in the kitchen, cooking, or can they use utensils and containers to stir or pour food? Can they use utensils to pour food and drinks? And then can they serve it onto their own plate? You then move through the other stages. I won't detail them now, but you can obviously take a screenshot of this slide where you move from smelling the food, touching the food, tasting the food, and eventually eating the food. I'll give you some time if you do want to take a screenshot of that. Okay. So Dr. K. Toomey identified 6 skills that need to be established to achieve successful eating. We've already touched on the first one, which is around postural stability. So the ability to sit upright is critical for self-feeding. Poor seating makes escape behaviors during mealtimes more likely. So do you find that your child is able to slide out of their chair? Do you find that they're not sitting upright, so it's actually more uncomfortable? Do they prefer to sit on the sofa? So these are things to think about with regards to successful eating. We've then got oral motor skills. So can they move food from the front of their mouth to the back of their mouth? Can they cup the tongue or the spoon? And can they close their lips appropriately for table foods? Then skill 3 is jaw skills. Are they able to break food apart? It might require medical advice or assessments to check whether there is enough saliva, for example, to break the foods apart, whether their teeth are appropriate in terms of biting down and chewing. And then the 4th skill is around sensory skills. Are they able to integrate all sensory systems? Number 5 is hand-to-mouth skills. Oops, sorry, it just jumped. Hand-to-mouth skills. So the ability to feed is usually seen at 14 months, and then to using a spoon, usually seen at 3 years. You've then also got parenting skills. So the ability of the parents to teach children how to eat developmentally appropriate foods, make mealtimes enjoyable, and understand the mechanisms of eating. Okay, increased food exposure. So we've already discussed graduated food exposure. So this might just be around not expecting your child to eat the food, but making sure that they're comfortable with simply interacting the food. Building up exposure can support with increased tolerance of different textures and sensory experiences. So doing this will create opportunities to have fun with food. And again, it removes the pressure from having to eat, but actually just interacting. So you can use special interests of your child and young person. It might be cutting the food up into princess crowns if they're especially interested in princesses, or exploring the foods from a country of their favorite singer or footballer. Some strategies or some activities that you can engage in with your child or young person is exploring smells, herbs and spices. You can create food music, which is again getting them to understand the textures, either making instruments out of beans, rices, and pulses, or food art. They can begin to paint with different vegetables, so beetroot to make purple, for example, or make necklaces out of pasta. There could also be the opportunity for food games. So you can have teddy bear picnics for younger children, and potentially model that, their teddy bear is eating a sandwich and really, really praising the teddy bear in that instance. Excursions also increase that food exposure. So you might take them to trips to the market or to the shops, and that is where the child is expected to maybe pick up the cheese or pick up the vegetable and put it into the basket. Just simple interactions that remove pressure from actually consuming the food. With regards to food preparation, they might get involved with cooking, so chopping up vegetables or pouring soup, or even creating smoothies, especially if they're motivated by colors or sounds. Smoothie making is potentially a fun activity for them. Messy play activities can include interactions with different textures and different food items, and also science experiments and feely bags. So right now, this is also extending upon the messy play activities and the orders of textures of messy play. So we have dry textures, which are considered a lot easier, and moving into dry textures that fall away, and wet textures that stick to the hand and are considered a little bit more challenging. Again, you can take a screenshot of this, but this is some messy play activities that you can engage in with your child. If we look at this with regards to food, some of the items that you can play with are firm and dry. So you might have broken pancakes, you might have cereals, you might have uncooked noodles or raw vegetables. These are firm and dry and are considered a little bit easier. Going into soft and dry, you might have icing sugar, cocoa powder, where the residue may stick to the hand. It can also include granulated sugar. And then to the more wet properties of textures, so we've got water itself, cooked noodles, cooked lentils, cooked pasta or spaghetti, and then also things like custard and yogurt. And then moving to the more challenging textures of food, which is the wet and sticky, and that might be melted chocolate, mashed bananas, tin spaghetti, or chocolate spread. So those are some examples of how you can interact and increase food exposure without having to consume it. So there are three other strategies that can be used to address feeding and eating challenges. The three that we'll outline is escape extinction, simultaneous presentation, and then sequential reinforcement. So the first escape extinction is not allowing your child to escape from eating. The food remains regardless of them displaying escape behaviors. So how that might look is that you do not remove the spoon from in front of their face when you're expecting them to eat. It might include some physical guidance. It also might include representation. So if they spat out the piece of apple, for example, you've then represented it again. However, with escape extinction, it does have some negative side effects, including an increase in behaviors that challenge. It is considered to be the more restrictive and more intrusive approach. We then also have simultaneous presentation, which is preferred food is presented with non-preferred food. So you might have done this at yourself, kind of trying to hide pieces of lettuce in between layers of sandwiches. So what happens there is that the flavor of the preferred food becomes associated with the non-preferred food, hopefully increasing preference. It can be successful if foods can be hidden or blended. So I know parents do try to hide fruits within smoothies, for example, but it can also be hard to fade or diminish the preferred food preference. And then the final one is sequential reinforcement. So this uses the Premack principle, If X, then Y. You might be familiar with this or had experience with this. It's known as the grandma's rule. So when grandma said, first eat your vegetables and then you can have your chocolate. It uses the highly preferred food as reinforcement and therefore increasing the motivation to eat the non-preferred food. So you'd reserve the reinforcement once they'd consumed the non-preferred food. So that might be, you can have your ice cream after you've had your vegetables, or you can have the chocolate once you've consumed a less preferred food. You can fade reinforcement by increasing your requirements. So it might be that they should consume, let's say, 2 pieces of broccoli before they get their dessert, and then 3 pieces before they get the dessert, and hopefully increase in time. In summary, feeding and eating challenges are quite complex. What works for one child may not work for another. So the strategies that we have outlined in this slides, again, it needs to be individualized. You need to see what works for your child. You want to also monitor the skills for successful eating. So going back to those 6 skills that were outlined by Toomey, those need encouraging. And if there are certain gaps and barriers, then that is where you might seek medical advice. Strategies that have been outlined are to make sure that meal times are that they are positive and they lessen anxieties around food. We want to promote positive experience with food, and that might include doing graduated exposure, which involves introducing foods very slowly, but also having fun with the foods. So overcoming feeding and eating challenges does require patience. We acknowledge that it will take gradual progression, but also small, consistent changes over time. So bear that in mind. Have patience with yourself. Have patience with the young people and children that you work with. That will be obviously supportive in them overcoming some of their eating challenges. So thank you for listening. I do believe we have almost gone over the lunch half an hour. So if you did have any questions or you had anything in the chat that you wanted to ask, we'll follow up those responses via email. But other than that, we have our next session, which is on positive behaviour support, a school-wide model, and that will be run by Matthew Wicks on Wednesday, 11th of October, 12:30. If you did find the Lunch and Learn today really helpful, then feel free to scan the QR code and consider donating a small donation for us. But otherwise, thank you for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your lunchtime. Thank you.